Chord. Hello, everybody. Today we're welcoming Dr. Roger Cirillo, former Lieutenant Colonel in the US Army. Some of you will already know him, and those who've read our book, Putin's War, Russian Genocide, Roger was one of our contributors. So today we're going to be talking about Roger's research and the work he's doing presently for his next book. But first, Roger, welcome to Fallout.
Thank you.
Roger, if you've got a moment, can you just give us a little short bio of your background, just for those people who are not aware of your background?
Yes, I served in the U.S. Army for 24 years. I served primarily in armored cavalry regiments. I was an instructor in the Army school system on three different occasions, all on military history. And I was on high-level staffs to include the Central Army Group War Plan staff for NATO and also headquarters U.S. Army Europe. I worked in the Commander-in-Chief's office as his personal assistant. Um, I finished up my career at the U.S. Army Center of Military History as their specialist on the Second World War during the 50th anniversary celebrations. And as a result, I traveled extensively, did battlefield tours for both military and civilian groups, and did some work for NATO, which is where I actually met um, Richard Holmes. And that started essentially my second career, so to speak, which was in history and publishing.
Yeah, I mean, it's through Richard that we met, in a sense,
That's right.
on our graduations, our mutual graduations, and our friend there. Oh, um, there was a third one, wasn't there? What's his name? Store.
Yeah, Jim Storm.
Jim Store, that was it.
Right.
And there is a picture of the three of us in our garbs. He was the only one in uniform. Um, so from Richard, you then went to, if I'm not mistaken, the Association of the US Army.
Yes, I worked first at the National World War II Memorial as their historian, and then moved over on invitation to set up a book program for the Association of the U.S. Army. And within this program, I recruited about 140 separate authors whose books we sponsored and were published by a variety of publishers. I dealt with about seven publishers while I was at AUSA. Published books to include your book, uh, Hitler's Bandit Hunters, and another set of books. And some of those books I'm still working on. I'm working with John Greenwood on the papers of General John J. Pershing, of which we published four volumes, and there are four more volumes to go. Um, but what we tried to do was to provide a platform for young authors, new authors, and particularly Army authors, although that wasn't particularly that successful. I got many more civilians than Army people, to publish research that would be of interest to professional soldiers and to scholars both. And that program still goes on, although I left it in 2017 to write a book on contract for the government. So, but it does carry on, and I am quite proud of the work that was done in it. One of the things that we had done was we had purchased the rights to Wehrmacht am Kampf, uh, which has somewhat controversial background, and that it was written. Those books were written by German officers primarily for the brand new Bundeswehr, so they could capture the experience of World War II. And a number of those books have been translated and published under the AUSA logo by Casemate. But my understanding is that the cost of translation versus what they actually gain back from sales has caused them to relook at the entire series. But there were, I think, 55 or so books within the series, of which about 10 have been published. So that's pretty much where it sits.
But you also, if I recall, invited people from or officers from other services. I think, if I recall rightly, there was now Colonel retired, Seth Folsom from the U.S. Marine Corps, and there were others. Uh,
Yes, and there were a number of international authors like Karl Heinz Frieser, who was at the military studies group at Potsdam. Um, we did a number of books with them that we translated from German into English and made them available for an English subject. We also had at least one Australian officer, one British general, Jonathan Bailey, who was a close friend, who wrote a book on artillery. Um, we had you, of course, which is an English author, publishing on a German subject. But there were a very wide array of things, but mainly 20th century. That's just the way it happened to fall out. Although we did have two books on the American Civil War and um, and a couple that were generic books on military art and science.
yeah, and of course, when we went over to, as was then the MGFA in Potsdam, the guys there, if you recall, took us on that staff ride of the Oder Front at Frankfurt.
Right, at Cirillo Heights.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
if you, they took us around the graveyard at the Chirurgie in Berlin, where we saw the former burial site of Reinhard Heydrich and Ernst Udet. So, and if you still remember that day, didn't we end up in a Cold War tower by accident?
yes, we did. We went to the Cold War Tower, which was to the right front of the cemetery as you faced east. And the operator of the tower was the brother of the first German who was killed trying to cross the wall.
That's right.
And he purchased that tower as a memorial for his brother.
But wasn't he busily defending the tower against redevelopment or going
That's right.
back?
That's right. There were Germans that thought that the tower was um, an eyesore. And of course, the Germans, as you know, are in the process of trying to destroy the Siegfried line at a cost of about 10 times what the original Siegfried line cost, to drill out of the ground all the dragon's teeth and blow up or bury all the pillboxes and things like that.
Well, the thing is, they should have looked at the files in the National Archives in UK, because actually the British, when they were occupiers or BOR in Germany, actually went around blowing up all the bunkers. It's quite funny. I was on the Ochsenkopf the other day, and two of the bunkers had been blown up internally.
Right,
And I looked through the files, and they were on the list that had been blown up by the British in the
right,
1940s and 50s. So
right.
late 40s, early 50s. So yeah, Germany somehow wants to get rid of any history that kind of goes from 1933 to 1970, which is, I
Yeah,
suppose, understandable, but they don't want the tourism. The dark tourism is to them becoming ugly, and I can appreciate that. But
I know when I was at Central Army Group, I wanted to form. a military historical group to parallel the ones that were at Shape and also at North Ank. And our chief of staff, who was a German officer, very fine man, was totally against it. He did not want to bring up anything from what he referred to as former times or the previous management, which he referred to as H. He would never use the name Hitler, and said that history is old stuff and the Germans need to move on. And and this, I think, was pretty much the feelings of my contemporaries on the staff, the German officers that were my age. Didn't want to hear about the Second World War, but the senior officers wanted to talk about it. And there was, as my colonel explained to me one day, my German colonel, Oberst Hübner, that there is a psychological split between the officers who were taught by what was known as the war generation and the next set of officers that were not. The war generation officers identified with Rommel and Guderian and wanted to talk about their things. And the guys that were my contemporaries, we were all majors at the time, although I made lieutenant colonel there, thought that those people had brought shame on Germany, and they didn't want to hear about it. They thought that anything about the Second World War was an accusation against the German people. And the funny thing was, we actually had on the staff, our civilian comptroller was a guy by the name of Heinz Koffold. And Koffold was a figure on German television all the time because he spoke beautiful English and he'd been in the 12th SS Panzer Division. And he'd been a Hitler Youth member. He was a sterling Hitler Youth member. As a 14-year-old, they sent him to Poland and put him in charge of 1,000 Polish youth, where he was supposed to turn them into rabid Nazis. And then he was actually recruited into and sent to the 12th SS Panzer Division, which was the Hitler Youth Division, and was a driver of a Mark IV tank, which was knocked out on either 7 or 8 June in Normandy. And then he was badly wounded, put in the hospital. When he came out of the hospital at the age of 16, they made him a Feldwebel, and they gave him a brand new Panzer Mark V Panther tank. And he and I took my Z4 sports car, and we drove from Heidelberg to the Ardennes, and we followed his tank through the woods right up until the point near Butgenbach. Well, he was shot in the head by a soldier from the Big Red One. He was standing on the rear deck of the tank refueling it. A sniper drilled him through the side of his head, which was why he was deafened on one side. But Heinz was a very, very interesting man. He was interesting in that I talked to him about the 20 July putsch against Hitler. And I asked him if he knew anything about it and what the feeling was at the time. And he stared at me and then he said, well, you have to understand that the Allies were pressing us from the west. The Russians were pressing us from the east. The Allies were bombing all of our cities. And then he stared at me and says, now was not the time to kill the Fuhrer. Now was the time to stand behind him and prove that we are real Germans. So I figured that he was kind of a lost cause about that point. But he was a wonderful guy. When I left Centag, he very emotionally presented me with the sleeve braid from his uniform.
Oh, wow.
That when he came from home from the war, his mother made him burn his uniform. And what he did was he kept his Iron Cross, his wound badge, and the sleeve title, Hitler Youth, and buried them in a box in his backyard. And that's all he had from his time in the German army. And he gave me the sleeve braid as a going away present, which I still have.
Oh, wow.
So, but but Germany was interesting because I did get to speak to a large number of people that were on the other side and got their views on things, and did get to speak to a German general, Gerd Niepold, who was a major, had worked with Stauffenberg to draw up the Barbarossa plan for Hitler. And he was at OKH and briefed Hitler daily from 1940 to 1943, after which he went to 7th Panzer Division in the East. He later wrote an almost unreadable book on the destruction of Army Group Center. But he talked to us at NATO about the high command, particularly their decision cycle that Hitler had, which was identical to the NATO decision cycle, how we briefed and made decisions. And he was a very, very interesting guy. He retired as a corps commander in the Bundeswehr. He was the last officer in the Bundeswehr to have served in the Reichswehr, and also to have gone to the Staff College, the Kriegsacademy, when it was run by uh, the early Wehrmacht. So, so I did get to meet a number of people. I mean, through my military service from various countries.
You
Um,
met some people on the Allied side, of course.
yeah, as an instructor at Leavenworth, hosted J. Lawton Collins because we were studying Seventh Corps operations, and he came and talked to my section, in fact. So I talked to him, and I talked to Pete Casada. I had earlier wrote to and talked to Matthew Ridgway. I talked to General Gavin. I talked to Bob Grow. I talked to Patton's chief of staff at length, Hobart Gay. Um, and then, of course, I talked to dozens and dozens of lesserlings who were at various ranks within the Army. From the time I was a little boy, I always looked up people that were in the war and asked them about what they had done and tried to get a feeling for what happened. And I think this was important because historians have lost the idea that the people that were in that war, one, didn't want to be in it to a large extent, and two, a lot of them that were in the war didn't think that it was either glorious or very well run. They thought it was a very confusing uh, series of self-adjusting disasters, and that battle in itself was not like it's portrayed in the movies or in history books. Uh, and that when it was over, you were a survivor. You were not really a victor. And and I think this is sort of the process you have with historians now who bought into very falsely this idea that there was a greatest generation. None of the greatest generation that I knew prior to 2000 ever would have believed that there was a greatest generation. They didn't buy that argument at all. Um, they thought that America was superior for a number of reasons, mainly because we had a lot of stuff and because we weren't bombed and we had an almost limitless industrial base and an almost limitless personnel base because we weren't taking the type of losses that other people did. And when the war was over, we ended up on top for a number of reasons. Um, and of course, the idea that America was the great superpower in the 1950s and 60s came about because we had the nuclear bomb and everybody else had been destroyed and we weren't.
I
So,
I think in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, there's been a shift away from what I would call um, the more academic leaning towards history, away from that towards popular history, which is heavily laced with nostalgia. And the problem with this content is it's being picked up by politicians and abused right readily. I think this latest incident where J.D. Vance came up with the idea that the Second World War ended in negotiation is just absurd. But after a while, you get fed up with the absurdities because all of these people, the media, the politicians, um, they don't seem to have had any kind of idea of critical analysis in their schooling and in their college.
oh,
And
I agree. I was on the um, presidential advisory board for the National World War II Memorial. And they invited me to speak there a number of times, several of which unfortunately were recorded or on YouTube. Um, and I got the impression that one of the reasons they never invited me back was because I was critical of things that had happened during the war. And their base relies heavily on nostalgia. It feeds people that go to the museum believing that we were somehow the saviors of the world and no one else was involved. And when they do mention other people that were involved, they disparage them and that we never did anything wrong. And that is, I don't think it's just an American trait. I think that's a national trait that people that don't want to hear about the reality of people. They don't want to hear that their leaders sometimes had a dark side. Their leaders sometimes were manipulative and lied, and that what we got out of the war was not the things that were sold to the population and why we were in the war. So, it becomes very difficult for people to approach the idea that history is supposed to be a discussion about what happened and an interpretation about happened. And granted, you have to understand the conditions of the time and what people thought at the time. And you're in dangerous waters when you start trying to judge people from history by current events and current feelings about things. I mean, my father's bomb group was escorted by black fighter pilots, and habitually, his group, because of where it was located, was tied to the 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen. And my father owed his life to two of those guys. There was no doubt about it. Um, but now you would think that the only people that flew in Italy were black fighter pilots, and there were only like 50 of them. 75, actually, I think, in the group is what they were authorized at one time. And although they were great guys, um, they actually never socialized with white pilots or white groups. And it was because the Army was segregated. And the few attempts that the white guys actually made to go to the black airfield to meet the guys that were flying escort for them, they were told to leave. The black guys didn't want to deal with them, and which they thought was kind of amazing. Um, and now it's been portrayed somewhat differently. But I think that the world in 1945 is a lot different than it is in 2025. And it's very dangerous, I think, to draw parallels between the two and say this equals that, because it doesn't. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah,
Uh,
I've noticed this year I've read a few books on 1945,
right.
and I find it very difficult to relate to them. Uh,
Yeah, I I think that the other thing is that history has been taken over by factions,
yes.
and
So,
there used to be very much disparaged in the 1970s what was known as the buttons and bugle guys that wanted to write about what happened in wars and were experts on the buttons and bugles and things like that. There were people that wanted to write about decisions that were made and technology that was made, and then they all of a sudden were mass assaulted by the sociologists, and they wanted to prove that women had a tremendous amount to do with the war, and they did. I don't know how you would give it a percentage of influence, and that minorities had a phenomenal amount to do with the war. And they did, but primarily not in decision making or leadership type things because of the way society was at the time. And now, in order to make up for the differences, they want to prove that they had all these super talented people at their beck and call. And they weren't super talented because that's not the way society educated them or developed them at the time. So it's kind of a remarkable thing. The Army went through this during my entire career. I came in the Army at the end of the Vietnam War, and that in itself was a tremendous lesson if you were a historian, because it was a really cold douche to come into the United States Army and find out that we were a defeated army in 1970. We were in really bad shape. Okay, we had race problems. We had huge political problems at home. The war in Vietnam was supposedly our fault and nobody else's. And you bore up under all of this. And then all of a sudden that went away when the draft went away. And then we had to build a new army based on volunteers. And that building in itself um, was an eye opener. It was an eye opener because we no longer had the talent that was brought in by the draft. Whether the draft certainly drafted a significant number of dummies, but it also drafted a significant number of college graduates. Okay. When I was a company commander, I had my driver had studied nuclear physics. Okay. He was not the average dummy from the ranks. Okay. Later, the people that we recruited were recruited under the title Be All You Could Be. And I remember my response to most of my troops was, I decide all you could be, and all you could be is a private. You know, it
I
was
do
a, it
recall, I
was a
do recall that conversation with General Treffry
right.
and General Sullivan. I don't, you may or may not recall, but it was a brief. It was about a 20-minute conversation about the reconstruction of the U.S. Army in the 70s and 80s following Vietnam.
That's right.
And,
That's right.
and and those two, I think, were at the front end of all of that, and
They were
it
they
struck
were
me as
both
such a
colonels.
fascinating story. Yeah,
Yeah, they were both colonels, and Treffery, of course, became the Inspector General of the Army. And Treffery was Inspector General when I was a captain, in fact. And Treffery had very, very profound effect on how the Army changed the way it did business, because the Inspector General was basically the guy who was supposed to overlook the systems of the Army, the personnel system, the acquisition system, the training, and everything else, and make sure the Army was up to standards. And he made some very sweeping changes, not only on how the inspections were done, but the attitude of how we should look at things. He was a very, very adult, mature guy that lived in a real world. He was not a martinet, was not a by the book character that thought that if it was in the rule book that had to be followed regardless. He realized that the world had changed, that technology had changed people, and that the personalities of people were molded by a completely different ambience from and he had started as an enlisted man. He was an enlisted man in the Second World War. And of course, Sullivan became the second youngest, if not youngest, chief of staff of the Army. He and MacArthur were both 50 when they became chief of staff of the Army. That's a very remarkable thing in itself.
But if you're on meeting them, you wouldn't imagine that they were you knew they were generals because of their standing, but to engage with them was not to imagine that you're engaging with generals,
Yeah, they
people
they
that
had
you
not.
could talk with.
Yeah, they had not fallen into the trap of some of the rent-a-generals that you have on television that are interviewed by news people. No, they uh, they were much more open to discussion. They had their belief system, and they certainly believed certain things were right or wrong, and that certain things had to be done a certain way because that was what they had learned over time. But they were open to other opinions. And the Second World War generation that I served under, when I first came in the Army, we had people that wore ribbons from three wars: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And they were, although in a lot of ways they were hard characters, in an awful lot of ways they had a greater understanding of the fact that human beings were different and they had breaking points. They were not as rigid, I think, as the people that came behind them. Um, they understood, for example, that things don't always go right. And I think that one of the things that you find from people that have been raised in the current generation is they have a very white and black view of things. And although they are street smart, they're not very people smart. And they don't deal well with people that have a different background. And that was not true from the World War II generation. The World War II generation dealt with everybody. I think that the United States benefited tremendously from the two world wars for one reason, that in both wars they drafted everybody. That in the First World War, there were 4 million men in the American Army, and 1 million of them did not speak English, to include both of my grandfathers who had been drafted. They both were in units that spoke Italian. Saying they became Americans by fighting in the First World War. Their sons were drafted into an army that spoke English, but was very much a hyphenated army, that people thought themselves as Irish, Italian, German, et cetera, and then American. And they learned to live with each other because they were thrown into the same circumstances. there's a movie quote that I happened to catch yesterday from the movie Failsafe, where these two old pilots are talking about flying in World War II. They're about to get in their jet age bomber with two hydrogen bombs in it. And one of them said, "You remember the crews on the B-24s?" He said they were Jews and Germans and Italians. Everybody had a personality that was different. He says the current kids are run on transistors. They don't know a thing about anything. And I think that was an attitude. The attitude was um, that you were there to prove yourself, and you earned your equality by proving yourself. And I think that the way people now prove themselves is a lot different. People don't flunk out. People get promoted and get awards and trophies for showing up. And that attitude, I think, is a modern liberal attitude where everybody has to be inclusive. And that was not the World War II generation. In the World War II generation, everybody went on a 20-mile hike and everybody finished. And if a guy couldn't finish, his buddies carried him. And nobody ever thought less of the guy because at some time in their lives, somebody had carried them. Everybody failed and everybody succeeded, but they finished together. That was pretty much the attitude of that army. And it's not the attitude of the society now. And I think that this attitude doesn't get picked up by historians who look at documents. And it's certainly not picked up by watching the History Channel where they have interviews with privates who comment on grand strategy. That somehow being a private on Iwo Jima makes you an expert on what Douglas MacArthur was thinking, or Franklin Roosevelt. And so I think in a lot of cases we have to be much more careful as historians, uh, as as how we absorb and evaluate information. It's
I think
certainly been the biggest part of my research is trying to learn how to evaluate what I'm reading or what I'm finding.
I find it very interesting. I watched a program of Guy Hamilton talking about making the film Battle of Britain. And he said the biggest problem with the fighter aces, the British fighter aces, was they were saying that on such and such a date they knew that the Germans had changed their tactics and they adjusted to cope with the change of tactics. And Guy Hamilton laid into them and said, "You couldn't possibly know. You weren't in those conference meetings. You didn't know it happened. It, you adjusted as the Germans changed, and you adjusted to them."
That's right. That's right. Because the it's funny you should mention the Battle of Britain because I watched it yesterday on
Okay.
television. Um, and you're right, because the conference on fighter tactics didn't actually happen until October 1940, where they had the big argument about the big wing and the little wing and everything else. And that was actually long after the Germans had switched tactics to night bombing. Um,
Well,
you
we live in a time where, I remember when the film Battle of Britain was made because in 1968 I was playing in a football match, an English soccer game as a little kid, and we looked up ahead and there were all these aircraft circling around, and
right,
as you do as a child, you're looking up,
right,
you're totally fascinated, and suddenly from behind us, these two Messerschmitts swooped over us, these 109 swooped over us, and it was just so exciting that moment.
right,
And it stuck in my mind. When I saw the film later that year, or no, it was the following year, 69, it came out, September. My grandmother took me, And my grandmother had been caught very badly in the December the 24th Blitz of Manchester in 1940. And the point in the film, if you remember, where the home where all the people have been evacuated, the evacuation shelter,
Right,
has been destroyed. My grandmother clenched my hand very
right.
tightly, and it's that memory that they saw then would carry on. And I still have those moments, when you're talking to relatives, and like my Uncle Jim had been at the Battle of El Alamein, and he had terrible recollections of what it was like fighting the Germans, and that the artillery firing that was hitting the Germans, some of those shells were misfiring and landing amongst themselves. And those kind of stories, they don't really figure in the modern histories because I think the veterans have disappeared now, and the new generation of historians are coming along. They take, as you say, comments from the privates who are talking about strategic movements and their little stories, and not really seeing the bigger picture, and have taken in to a certain extent this idea that it was a great generation. Um, Funny enough, I was in Chicago when Tom Brocco gave that talk about the great generation. Um, and back then in the 80s, I just wasn't convinced because um, I had so many relatives who were in the Second World War. My whole life for a long period, up until I was about 17, 18, had been listening to all of these talking about the war because when there was a family gathering, they would talk about the war. And what they talked about wasn't something that I wanted to be in. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to hear about it. But if somebody said, "Would you want to be in the Second World War?" it would have been a decisive no. And because of what they'd suffered and how things had gone down, I thought they were all incredibly brave people. I thought they were fantastic people.
Yeah, I think they were. My father, who was on an air crew and flew out of Italy, um, told me that they flew because they had to. And he said we were all in it. Everybody was going to go on the mission, so you had to go on the mission, and you didn't want to not go. But nobody really would have preferred to have been in combat. That was not a normal thing. And that the rare times that people came down to visit the group and talk to the group and gave what in the movies would be considered a fighting talk, he said the crews booed him.
Yeah.
They didn't want to hear this stuff, you know. And
I I think the thing that fazed me in those latter years of their lives was how damaged they were. And I don't
yeah,
mean that in an unpleasant way.
yeah,
War had been hard on them, and you know, they'd come home. Nobody was particularly interested in their life because everybody had been through the same process. So there was no kind of socializing. There was no social workers to come and help them overcome their problems. And some of them, those who had been frontline soldiers were still suffering nightmares into the 70s and 80s.
yeah. That was true. That was true for my father, and it was true for a lot of them. It's interesting that just yesterday on television, on the TCM network, there was a discussion by the know-it-alls that talk about film that that William Wyler's film "The Best Years of Our Lives," um, the guy assigned to write the script was a guy by the name of Sherwood, who had been one of Roosevelt's propagandists. And he opposed the film because he said, well, in 6 months, all of this will be by the board, that the war will be a memory, that nobody will have any uh, reintroduction to society problems, that the war is only going to be a memory and that it's not going to stay with people. Well, that was indicative of this left wing cabal of people that were intent on putting us into the war, and none of them fought it. And then afterwards, they disparaged the people that were in it. And the people that were in it never got over it. I can tell you for a fact, because when I came in the Army, in my platoon, there were only two people that were not in Vietnam. Me, because I came in at the end, and my platoon sergeant, because he had been in Korea. And all the soldiers had come back from Vietnam, and they were all screwed up. They all had problems beyond your wildest dreams. One of them committed suicide, in fact. And I saw firsthand what PTSD was. The American Army suffered from PTSD for about 10 years after Vietnam. There were a lot of people that were Vietnam vets that did odd things. And without getting into it, you could see that some of the habits and some of the things that were excused were because other people who had been there recognized that these people had problems and that they had stayed in the Army for reasons of their own accord, and that we wanted to keep them, and that in order to keep them, you had to make allowances for their quirks. And so you had to be a psychologist in the sense that you had to deal with these people, and you also had to get them to do the kinds of things that you wanted them to do. The army that fought in the Second World War went into non-performance for like 5 years, and then the Korean War came about. And if you talk to guys that were in both World War II and Korea, they will immediately tell you that the thing that was astounding about Korea was how much that people who should have known better, that had been in a war, that had done all of these things, had to relearn the emotions and the ability to do it all over again. And then if they stayed for the third war, you had the same problem. So I remember I always asked guys that had rows of ribbons for all three wars how the wars were different. And they talked a lot about the Second World War, and they talked a lot about Vietnam, but none of them ever talked about Korea. Ever. They did not want to talk about Korea. So I finally asked Paul Brame, who was my first published author, who had been in all three wars, gotten a battlefield commission in the Second World War, and had commanded at squad level, platoon level, company level, and battalion level, and brigade level in combat in all of these three wars, said to me, he said, of the three wars, the worst one was Korea. He said physically, it was the hardest one to deal with because of the weather and the terrain. And emotionally, it was the hardest one to get used to because you really didn't understand why we were there. People understood why you were in the Second World War. They actually understood why they were in Vietnam. But in Korea, he said, we got stuck there. We were in this war. We didn't identify with the Koreans, and we were fighting not Koreans, we were fighting Chinese. So he said it was a completely different thing. And Paul was very interesting because he always brought out the human parts of the fight, not the tactical part where you were interested in the big decision or the little decision. And one time he almost cried and he told me, he said, I planned this attack and based on his experience in the Second World War. And he said he'd lost an entire platoon of about 35 men killed in a period of about 4 seconds. And he just looked at me, and it was, you could see that he still couldn't get over that. that that he had gamed this thing right, and the Chinese had gamed it in reverse, and they were waiting for him. And these guys walked into a trap, and they were gone. There was nothing that he could do about it. And that's when you realize that there's things that are in history books that just don't make it into the history books. You know, I mean, if you read the books on the Korean War, of which there are not that many well done, they talk about 1950 and they talk about uh, the Hill War, the outposts. And in between, they've kind of lost a sense of what had happened. And so I think the big corrective for historians is you have to find people that can explain to you what it was like to be there and what they did. And that's certainly the thing that I've tried the hardest to do. Uh, and certainly it's very difficult because the level at which I'm now researching is really on the Supreme Command to get an idea of what these guys actually thought. And you could find a lot of material in the sense that decisions were written down, there are meeting notes, there are message traffic. But what you don't get is the understanding of the people that are passing these messages back and forth as to what they believe and what they know and everything else. And particularly when you get to Arnhem, you find out there's a tremendous amount of bullshit about it. That the it wasn't as clear to everybody, couldn't have been, as to how they put it together. And I've talked to people who were at Arnhem. I talked to two of the generals that were at Arnhem. Um, I've looked at all of the intelligence, and you get the idea that everything was cut and dry and everything was known beforehand, and that was not true. It's just simply not true. The other thing is that you find out that there are more sins of omission than commission, that there are more people that didn't do something they could have, as opposed to did something right or wrong. And you have to somehow account for that in the long run. And
I
that makes
found
it
a
very difficult.
I found a great deal of difference between what had been written about Aachen and what those combat reports that you very kindly got hold of for me said. I think the thing that surprised me most when I looked at those 104 combat reports was the story that had been written bore no resemblance whatsoever to the reports. And the reports had all been written within maybe a week of the end of the siege.
Right.
So you had combat reports from the beginning of the siege, which is going back to early September, but being written after the 24th of October. And in that time, you're hoping that the person who's written the report or has taken the notes from the people he's interviewed to write that report has somehow gained some accuracy. And it suddenly dawned on me all of these tank units who had been part of the operations in Aachen actually were not recording their actions in Aachen. And I suddenly realized that, we know Slam Marshall was the historian behind all of these papers, but that there was a disconnect between what we thought was the battle that had been written and the reports that we were reading. And there was such a huge gap. And then when you pulled the Germans into the story, the whole thing became incredibly confusing because you had the Germans giving out one set of reports of what they've done, which was almost completely counter to what the Americans had claimed had happened. And I think one of the things that completely fascinated me was I think it was the battalion report written in 1947 by the battalion commander, and it didn't seem to bear any relationship to the combat reports that had been written 3 years before. So I was at I was at odds, and I don't know if you recall, I actually went round Bobby Brown's area of the fight to look at how the that report had been constructed, how the ground looked to the report that had been constructed, and found a complete disconnect. That if he had been in a if he'd have been in the cemetery, which that cemetery has never changed, it's been there since the 1880s. If he was in that cemetery overlooking the bunker, he would have had to have overlooked what is now a major area which is divided by a motorway, an autobahn. So he would have actually been looking without binoculars, even in a straight line of sight. He couldn't possibly have seen the bunker on the side of Crucifix Hill that was pointing in a different direction. Do you see what I mean? Those kind of limits to the report told me that something had happened. Now, as you know, I mentioned it before, Bobby Brown, I don't think was as literate as the battle report was suggested because he'd been a sharecropper to the age of 12 and he had no proper education. So I think somebody wrote it for him very kindly, and he got the report written after his Medal of Honor. So it wasn't written to get him the Medal of Honor. It was a report after the Medal of Honor. So, and I think that was one of these guys helping out one of their friends. And I think, that's a little moment. You don't want to take it away from Bobby Brown because of what he did as a soldier, but his actions on that hill don't mirror the report. They can't possibly do because of the line of sights just don't work.
Yeah, there are no less than three books that have been written about Alvin York and his Medal of Honor, and they all disagree. And there's been at least two studies on the ground done with metal detectors and GPS and everything else as to where the fight was. And what you find in those reports is that sometimes the variance and where people think they were maybe as less as 20 or 30 feet because you can figure out where they were by the shell casings that are left behind. And the distance of 20 or 30 feet on uneven ground puts you in a different world
That's right.
in a lot of cases. The same problem has happened with the Little Bighorn that they have done tremendous numbers of excavations and things after the grass was burned in the 1980s and found bones and everything else about where the Indians actually were and all this other things. And they came up with a remarkable amount of information that was never in the final report or part of the legend. One of which was that the Indians not only outnumbered the soldiers, they outgunned them. The Indians had repeater rifles and the soldiers didn't. And you can find shell casings that you could track the individual gun across the battlefield. And you could see how the Indians beat these people down. The second thing is that you could go to the observation point, Weir Point, that overlooked where Custer was. And they could see Custer fighting in the distance, but they couldn't see it clearly. And you could see that people's imagery of what they heard and what they believed didn't necessarily uh, jive completely with what happened underground. It's almost like an illusion. Um, Slam Marshall was a very interesting guy. I talked to him a number of times, and I spent um, maybe a half an hour to an hour with him alone once. Well, he told me how he wrote and things like that, and he was very helpful. He's a very controversial character for a number of reasons. Um, but I remember he said to me, he said that if you talk to a lot of people that are in one engagement, you have to account for the fact that they are all in different places at the same time, that they see different things. And in order to describe it, you're almost changing the chronology because the chronology that you mention it is not the same chronology that they see it. And he said that if you can get it about 80% right, that's the best you could possibly do. You'll never be able to recreate an event that has more than two people in it on two different places at the same time. And that what he tried to do was to convey the essence of what happened. And of course, because he became very didactic about it and became very controversial. Um, People later attacked him personally. Whether he deserved that or not is irrelevant. But historians have the same problem because they get the same document about two separate events, and you try to decide, well, how did this really happen? What did they actually know? I'm having problems right now on writing something because there are three things that are going on at the same virtual moment. That Eisenhower is writing a directive. Monty is writing a message to question the directive which he hasn't gotten yet. And the third thing is Antwerp is being entered. So the question is, how does one affect the other? Because after the war, everybody complained that, well, we didn't clear Antwerp and it was obvious. Well, it wasn't obvious at the time, despite of what people said. The second thing is, it didn't appear to be that important to either Eisenhower or Monty at that particular moment for a reason. They were clearing a number of ports all at the same time. And although one is bigger than the other, that doesn't necessarily mean it is more important because of where the ships come in and where the rail line is and everything else. So everything becomes relative. And afterwards, when you look at the decisions, it's easy to say, well, they made a decision about this on this day and it proved to be wrong. And you find out there's no record of that decision. So you wonder, what did they actually know on those days? And that becomes part of the problem. What I'm trying to deal with is the intellectual part of high command, which in a coalition is always governed by what is written much more than what is said. There is always a written directive. There is always a set of notes, and the meeting and what happens in the meeting in some cases is less important because you follow the written notes to make your orders and everything else. So this is one of the problems of history, and it's not only a problem for somebody that understands it. I think it's more of a problem for somebody that doesn't understand it, that, that they're unaware of these simultaneous events and that they're unaware of the fact that not everything is known in real time. I mean, we live in a world now where we can do Zoom meetings like this. We live in a world where you could send an email across the world and it arrives in seconds, if not in a minute or whatever. And you think that everything can be simultaneously tracked, and that certainly was not that way in the Second World War. Even when you sent an electrical message, if you got it within 12 hours, you were doing good because it had to be retransmitted in a lot of cases. Then it had to be decoded. Then it had to be printed, and then it had to come to you through the staff. And that did not happen in real time. And the ability to use a telephone over long distances was not possible. Not only because the system didn't have it, you had the problem of retransmitting and also enciphering it. On the Mickey Mouse phone or the Donald Duck phone is, I guess, what they called it at the time. I've used those, by the way. Those are a real trip. Um, so these are the things that I'm trying to put into the book, and I think these are the things that are going to upset people because what happens is I give people more leeway than historians don't want to give leeway. They write history seemingly to me is prosecutorial. That the historian knows all. He's got the son of a bitch in the dock and he wants him condemned. And that's the way it's going to be. And, and I guess that suits lawyers, but it doesn't suit reality. That's really not the way most things work. And I think that's the hard part now of writing history and understanding history.
Let's just stop there and take a break,
Okay.
and we'll pick it up again in just a moment because I think we need a break.
Okay.